We're so pleased to have Heidi Butz here today. Heidi has been, it'll be 30 years, a member here, and she's the mom of she and David, parents of 4 children who were raised in the church, and she is and I'm sure she'll tell you all about this too, but she is the director of counseling at Green Hill School, and also a therapist in private practice here in town. She got an MSW from undergrad from Northwestern, right?
Yes.
And MSW from here, our wonderful School of Social Work. There are cards, business cards here and on the table. Pick them up on your way out, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much, Barb. Hi, everybody. It is really lovely and a privilege to be here speaking with all of you. I want to thank the Faith Formation Committee for inviting me today. As Barb mentioned, next June marks 30 years of our family's affiliation with First Presbyterian. We are so grateful to this church. We have been the beneficiaries of the generosity of its members and clergy and staff in so many, many ways. My plan this morning is to talk about mental health and well-being sort of across the lifespan, mainly with adolescents and adults. And during this conversation, there'll be a couple of opportunities for us to circle up together and connect with one another. And at the end, of course, I'm happy to take questions. I rely heavily on the work of psychologist Lisa D'Amour in this talk. And while I hope this conversation will be accessible and informative on the topic of mental health can also be challenging. This talk contains some references to suicide, and I also want to acknowledge that each of us carry our own narrative connected to mental health. Some of us were raised by people who were profoundly unwell. Some of us have children who are suffering. Some of us are struggling right now. Thank you to each one of you for being here. In my role in terms of why I was invited here, as Barb mentioned, my husband David and I are parents of 4 children, ranging from mid-20s to early 30s. I'm a clinical social worker, and I received my master's at U of M, as Barb mentioned, and I was a late in life grad student. And for the past 8 years, I've been the director of counseling at Green Hills, an independent school here in town for grades 6 through 12. Additionally, I regularly take shifts in the psychiatric emergency services. That's the psych ER at U of M. And I do have a private therapy practice, and that practice is for adults. So these 3 roles give me specific lenses through which to observe young people in the school context, adults in the therapeutic context, and people of all ages experiencing mental health crises. In thinking about this conversation today, I was struck by the metaphor of what happens when someone arrives at the U of M emergency services. So if you have a broken arm, you go to the right for emergency medical treatment. And if you're experiencing suicidal ideation or having a manic episode, you go to the left for emergency mental health treatment. And that parity in that moment between physical health and mental health, I just think is really like one moment when these things are truly equal. We know, of course, that subsequently that analogy breaks down very quickly. We all know all too well there's an enormous gap between the demand for mental health services and the supply of providers and care facilities. There's a lack of holistic care, and all of this happens underneath the umbrella of a layered and confusing and often broken healthcare system. We all also read the headlines, we hear the headlines about adolescent mental health, about suicide rates, and about loneliness. The pandemic was a doozy for our kids. The 6th graders who entered Green Hills in the fall of 2022, 2 years into the pandemic, were distinctly younger than the 6th graders we welcomed in 2019. And I mean that much more in a developmental sense than I do in an academic one. They lost those years of navigating social dynamics, of tolerating the distress of not being invited to the birthday party, or of feeling a little homesick at a sleepover but sticking it out, of adapting to a new friend situation in the context of lunch, all of those little bumps that foster resilience. And a 9th grader in 2022 managed all of the strong emotions of puberty, of feeling confused and angry and scared, often without knowing why. They managed that from their basements alone. So all of this coincided with a world where the topics of mental health and mental health diagnoses are entering our collective vernacular in really kind of a revolutionary way. Young people's access to information through their phones and the expansion of content providers like Netflix and Hulu, the unlimited access to information, whether or not it's correct, through YouTube, all serve to reduce the stigma around the general topic of mental health. And this is so very important and so good, and it's a beautiful thing that mental health concerns among young people are finally allowed to come out of the closet. This hit me in a really concrete way about 8 years ago. At that time, in grad school and also at the U of M, we were discouraged, essentially not permitted, to put in someone's chart the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. That disorder was considered so stigmatizing. So we would work around it and put some of the symptoms in the chart and handle it that way. And about a year later, I was in my office at Green Hills, and a student came in and they sat down and we were chatting, and they said, "I think I have borderline personality disorder." And I was just absolutely stunned. And through the remarkable work of Marcia Linehan, a psychologist who has borderline personality disorder and who created dialectical behavioral therapy, so much of the stigma, in particular around borderline personality disorder, has been eliminated. And a side note, dialectical behavioral therapy is the gold standard of treatment for BPD. It's a therapy whose principles are that to achieve meaningful and happy lives, people must learn to sit in the dialectic of opposing ideas. So on the one hand, we must accept things as they are, and on the other hand, the dialectic is that change is also necessary for growth and for happiness. So a lot of us heard the headlines last winter about the dire state of adolescent mental health, and we want to pay close attention to some of those troubling statistics, particularly for girls who were twice as likely to experience sadness and hopelessness than their male peers, particularly for our LGBTQIA+ young people who experienced more violence and mental distress than their heterosexual and cisgendered peers, and particularly for Black students who experienced a higher rate of increase of suicide than their white peers. It's important to note that these data were gathered in 2021 at the height of the pandemic, and it will be really interesting to see what the next round of data gathering along these lines shows. So I was hoping maybe just for a few minutes we could circle up in small groups and talk a little bit about any awareness that we might have about stigma and mental health, any questions we might have, anything we've noticed over the course of time. Would that be okay for people to find each other? And I'll join you all in the back.
Oh, we'll be a big group here. Laurel's going to join you.
Oh, yeah.
It's really wonderful to meet you. It's wonderful to see you. Hello. Hi. How are you? That's okay. Tell us your name again. Laurel. Coffee. Diane.
I've seen you before.
Such an interesting topic, isn't it? And just our own experiences maybe and how we've seen that play out. People want to be I just off the top of my head have a couple of stories, which I won't go into detail with, but just that some of them kids that had the joy of being friends. It really has been a joy for them driven to transition through time in high school. Them helping friends, that part of the process
In business school, they're not that far from being
it was a hard step for kids to make as young people. It was little steps at a time. They felt comfortable enough to become who they were supposed to be. But I know along the way there was a lot of fear. Get worried about how much
So tell me what issues she said and anxiety. What age?
So the children that I'm talking about, they were young adults, they were in high school. So both of two folks that I'm thinking of that my kids have to be friends with. One was started this in 10th grade.
And then her sister took her home.
Started his 10th grade year by her 12th grade year. People that were fully transitioned. And then my other son also was a transition buddy as well. And then by 11th grade, years, but very they really were. They were kids that were surrounded.
So when I got to go to know that because
Other
I always tell her I'm doing
the band program actually, which is
so I want to learn as much as I
that's
can.
wonderful. People that kind of safe kids who are, I don't want to say different, but who also are finding their way, and everybody's doing
Clearly seeking.
So I read 5 books on
Did they
intervention thing is just continue, don't do it, just stay.
Yeah, a little bit. We actually could, if settings with at least one
And now she has a job at U of
person. And that's with the parents as well to an extent because our kids
She
did
loves
play
it, and they
trombone.
love her.
And they both took lessons from the same trombone instructor, and so we had a chance to be closer level. And it is a hard journey for the whole
Oh,
family.
that's great that she's in town though, and is your other daughter in town too?
She's in Canton, but on the western end.
That is the positive side, so I'm starting off on a positive note. You're right.
Really been stigmatizing and unfortunately, whether it's alcohol or mental health, it's not.
No, that's not. It's a part-time job, they might do it full-time because their mother
My son was in suicide.
Yeah,
we are, then we always, in the back of your mind, but when you now interact with the parents, it's always in the back of your mind.
So did you
Want
have
to be
nursing,
supportive,
because your other guy
you
was
don't
nursing.
know.
Yes, well, and
It's
it's
all
the
they
other
think
one,
about
they're
every day.
going into nursing. And then this came along, so we got the art here in the hospital.
I don't know how to do that, but it's.
So being able to remember the child, or are you saying?
I would say both. Remember the
ask about
childhood,
them.
how can we support them?
Yeah,
How can we
also
help?
remembering that they're all getting this early.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, with terrible things that were in their lives. In their lives.
I don't know.
I had somebody share with me once that there was a similar situation or loss like that, and they said what brought them a lot of comfort was the fact being they said even just not talking to me with somebody who understands this kind of pain has been really helpful. It's funny because we want to all help, but sometimes you don't know what to say. But people who already been through it seem to have unfortunately, it's a sad, but it's a special knowledge of that person. Yeah, it's hard because we don't show kindness and love.
All right,
Would,
come back
Oh,
together.
we have to stop. I'm sorry, I hope I didn't hear
so much Could we have maybe one or two volunteers from one or two groups, just briefly share out about what you were engaging with?
Once a mother, always a mother.
And how much we learn from our children about the experience of mental health challenges.
Thank you, Jane.
Our parents' generation would ignore it or not
Yes.
believe that it even existed, would not talk. But also our parents' generation, from my perspective, as parents would, I never remember my dad and mom having these really deep conversations about things.
Yeah.
Everything was just getting through life and so on and so forth. Also, we talked about the fact that, mental illness it crosses all socioeconomic backgrounds.
Yeah.
And sadly, my grandson was involved with some issues. And fortunately, there was enough money for him to be able to receive excellent care.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that's not the way that it is.
Yeah.
And he was at the University of Michigan, as a matter of fact, with an issue. And he was released before he really should have been released. And within 2 days, he was right back in again.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, those are some of the issues that we face. And the young people who are committing these horrific crimes of going into churches and schools and so on and so forth, desperately need those kinds of things that are not available.
Thank you for that example that vividly points out when we referred to the brokenness of the healthcare system, you lived that. And I also appreciate you bringing up the disparities in healthcare and mental health care. I touch on that, but that's a whole other really important lens through which to view this topic. Thank you. So in coming back to our conversation about adolescence, I want us all to know and really internalize this important fact, if you remember one thing. The strongest force for adolescent mental health and well-being is a caring relationship with a loving adult. Teenagers need adults who get them and who back them and who are connected to them. Again, adolescents need the steady presence of a warm and caring adult. And knowing this, here is where I want to put a bit of a different frame around the conversation of adolescent well-being. With so many headlines about mental health concerns among young people, we're noticing that parents are now feeling frightened of the distress in their kids. parents need more support around the fact that no matter what we do, there will be times when our kids are really in quite a bit of distress, and that's just the natural course of life. Parents and caregivers seem to have gotten the message that we should be able to shield our children from pain. But the way we can be most useful to our kids is not to be frightened of their pain or of their worries, not to minimize them, not to try to hurry them away, but to take very seriously that they sometimes have negative feelings, and to show them with our own steady presence that they don't have to be scared of their negative feelings, and that we aren't scared of our negative feelings. Children's pain is not a sign that somehow we have failed or not come through as a parent. Moods in teens can fluctuate dramatically, and depression in adolescence looks very much like a prickly porcupine who's annoyed by everybody. But because of these sort of constant ups and downs in puberty, if your young person is feeling low consistently for more than 48 hours, that might be where concern would start for me. They have a different time horizon, right? So in our conversations, we are seeing a conflation of psychological distress and mental health concerns. Sorry. As though they are one and the same, and they are not. Being mentally healthy is often falsely equated with feeling good or calm or relaxed. And those are lovely things, but it's not how we assess mental health. And it's in fact often the inverse. Much of the time, the presence of distress and the experience of distress is evidence of mental health. And what we mean by that is there are lots of circumstances in daily life where we fully expect to see distress. If a kid's best friend moves away, we expect to see sadness. We would actually be more concerned about the lack of sadness. Or if they have a huge test they're not prepared for, and that test is tomorrow, well then yeah, some worry and anxiety are going to show up. This is what we'd rather see compared to indifference. So we're looking for two things. First, do the feelings fit the situation, even if they are negative or unwanted or unpleasant? Are they proportional to the event? And then second, and maybe even more importantly, are these feelings being managed effectively? Are they managed in a way that brings relief and does no harm? Or are they managed in a way that brings relief, but that relief is going to come at some cost? So back to the initial distress, what's the coping strategy that's happening to manage the distress? Does cuddling with your cat make you feel better? Does doing yoga make you feel better? Are you able to talk with your bestie or your teammate? We want our young people to steer clear of coping that comes at a price down the line, whether that's abusing substances or being hard on people or taking it out on themselves. So psychological distress actually has value. It helps us make decisions. It helps guide our thinking. Managing distress is also growth-giving. And another key point here is that parents and caregivers' ability to tolerate distress is directly correlated to a child's ability to do the same thing. So we do well to think about ourselves in terms of these topics. There's a lot to say about adolescent mental health and social media. I recommend delaying kids' use of social media as long as possible. If I ruled the world, there'd be no smartphones for kids until high school. There are correlations between social media use and the rise in adolescent depression. That number has been shown to be being on social media more than 3 hours a day. But with social media, it's not so much the distraction, but the dose. Social media is brutal around the topic of body image. It purposely creates distorted views of ourselves. and of other people at a particularly vulnerable time in brain development for children. And at the same time, there's also a lot of benefits to social media. Students and kids feel less isolated, they learn about new cultural and societal issues, they bond with their friends, and they have fun. And where social media use is of particular interest to me is in the context of sleep. Sleep is a foundational and fundamental principle of adolescent mental health. And I was picturing myself standing up here, and I just want to acknowledge that like nothing is more boring than being told that we should be sleeping. I'm sorry, and I stand by it. It's very crucial. Every month there are new studies coming out that solidifies that sleep is utterly foundational, not just to mental health, but to health in general. 70% of young people don't get enough sleep. Middle schoolers need 10 to 11 hours a night. High schoolers need 9. When students are sleep deprived, they're grumpier, they have a harder time focusing and remembering things, and they are less like themselves, and they like other people less. So I'm going to use this intersection between sleep and technology as the transition to our conversation about mental health in adults. None of us should have our phones in our rooms. There's data showing that we do not get as good sleep when technology is in our room, even if we're not looking at it. And the researchers surmise that we are all so attached to our devices that even while we are sleeping, if the phones are nearby, a piece of our energy is being deployed and not engaging with that thing. And we just don't sleep as well, and I find that really, really fascinating. Excuse me. Sleep is the glue that holds all of us together, not just adolescents. So when we're in crisis, therapists often start with the question of sleep. If someone is sleeping, then the person and the therapist can get down to the work of the crisis. And if they're not sleeping, then the therapist gets down to the work of talking about how to get sleep. And we need to do that to even have a chance of tackling the issue at the core. It's sort of similar to what we know in the mental health world as a dual diagnosis. So that's when someone has a mental health disorder and also has a co-occurring substance use disorder. In that case, we have to treat the substance use disorder first. We can't tackle, for example, the depression if someone is consistently not sober. It's the same thing with sleep. Sleep is so foundational to well-being, and there are other ways that we can take care of ourselves in these times that are both exciting and dynamic and also challenging and overwhelming. Ups and downs are part of our lives. They're expected. And for some of us, it can be difficult to tease out the difference between regular ups and downs and symptoms that might be a bit more concerning. One thing we know, and I'm generalizing here, but is that in men, depression tends to manifest as tiredness, irritability, and anger. And in women, it often presents as sadness, feelings of worthlessness, excuse me, and guilt. So the differences between sadness or the blues and depression, there are a few things that are pretty easy to point to. One is when we're sad, we're usually sad about something. So my pet has died, or I've lost my job. Whereas with depression, there's sort of a cloud that covers everything. And another distinction is that in sadness, we're sad because somehow the world has become a bit more impoverished. So again, the pet has died, the job is lost, there's a loss in the world. With depression, that sense of impoverishment also extends to the self. so it turns inward. And with depression, we hear people saying, I'm no good, I'm a burden to my family, it would be better for people if I weren't here taking up time and energy. You don't hear that in sadness, right? That's depression. And a note here about suicide that I mentioned at the start. If you find yourself struggling with persistent thoughts of suicide, or you're thinking about a method or making plans to take your life, or you don't feel like you can keep yourself safe, those would be reasons to go to your nearest emergency room. Also, if you're concerned about a family member or a young person or an adult friend, it is okay to check in with them and ask them if they are having thoughts about killing themselves. The research shows us that asking people if they are having these thoughts does not put the idea in their head, and in fact, it's often profoundly relieving. So to give you a sense of what we mean by depression, the diagnostic criteria is that 5 or more of the following symptoms have been present in the same 2-week period and represent a change in functioning. And there are a couple of more specifics, but we don't need to go over those here. But persistent, sad, anxious, and empty mood, feelings of hopelessness and pessimism and worthlessness, loss of interest in things we used to enjoy, decreased energy or fatigue, feeling slowed down like you're walking through molasses, difficulty concentrating and making decisions, not enough sleep or too much sleep, low appetite or overeating, again over a 2-week period. So if you find yourself fitting into this category, it's probably time to check in with your PCP. There are effective and reliable treatments for depression. We know that psychotherapy is helpful, we know that medications are helpful, and the most efficacious and evidence-based approach is actually a combination of both. So by therapy, we mean supportive and interpersonal therapy. So what happens in therapy? In therapy, experiences from our past, sometimes painful ones, can be viewed within a safer and more connected relationship, the therapeutic one. The events of our past remain, of course, they are fixed, but our story about the event, that is what changes, and then we change. Cognitive behavioral therapy, I imagine most of you have at least heard of CBT. It's the most widely studied intervention for depression, and it includes learning ways to modify negative cognitions, or what we call cognitive distortions. So some of those faulty thought patterns that can lead us to be depressed include things like all or nothing thinking, jumping to conclusions, catastrophizing. And in therapy, we learn to put some distance between oneself and one's emotions. And this is a tricky one to wrap our minds around, but learning this idea that feelings are not facts. And in psychodynamic therapy, we work to create a space between us and what is running through our head. We work on skills like deep breathing, pretending to be a fly on the wall and observing from the outside, imagining that our thoughts are leaves in a stream that's passing by and floating away. And all of these are well-recognized tools to dilute the power of feelings and provide some perspective and promote sort of self-regulation and calm. Mindfulness and meditation serve these goals as well. Another beautiful thing about therapy is that it underscores that act of connection. So that in and of itself can be healing. And regarding therapy and therapists, we know that the most important factor in the success of therapy is a relationship and connection and a feeling of comfort with the person that is our therapist. So as opposed to the specific modality that's being used, research shows at the end of the day, it's the connection. So therapy isn't just a place for us to revisit and vent and talk about difficult things over and over. We use strength-based approaches where we want to understand what's wrong or what's not going very well. But we don't only have to ask what's wrong, we can ask what's strong. Focusing on a person's strengths may be a more effective way for navigating challenges than fixating on the problems. So similarly, if your best friend calls you to talk about something that's bothering him, avoid questions that encourage him to revisit every detail. Sometimes we're inclined to say, start from the beginning, tell me everything. And this will lead to a play-by-play of what took place and what he was feeling. Consider instead posing a question, for example, that helps give your friend some distance from what he's experiencing. So a question like, if someone else were in this situation, what advice would you give them? Rather than dwelling on all the details of what happened again and again, helping the person to generate a plan of action and capitalizing on their strengths. Depression often walks hand in hand with anxiety. Feeling anxious can be deeply uncomfortable. It's also perfectly normal. So the key difference between having an anxiety disorder and normal anxiety or worry is the extent of the dysfunction and the distress that it causes. So generalized anxiety disorder, which is the formal name for the most common anxiety diagnosis, is characterized by persistent, excessive, and unrealistic worry about everyday things. So this worry could be multifocal, worrying about family and finances and health and the future. Anxiety disorders show up like with your worry being excessive and difficult to control and non-stop. Often it comes with non-specific psychological and physical symptoms as well. Anxiety is not all bad, and the absence of anxiety is not all good. And sometimes, and you may notice this too in the current conversation, any reference to anxiety in any form comes up as something to be minimized or avoided or treated. But by pathologizing anxiety, we also miss out on the opportunity to learn and potentially grow from it. So the good news about anxiety is that it's one of the most highly treatable mental health disorders. Like depression, the treatments include therapy and medications, but we add in another element, and those are relaxation techniques. We don't have the time to go over a lot of specifics here, but meditating, breathing techniques, progressive muscle relaxation, visualization, all of these are effective tools for managing anxiety. And these interventions are also forms of self-care that can be added to the list of ways that we take care of ourselves. And none of these are good enough to eradicate clinical depression or clinical anxiety, but they're also preventative measures, and they're critical well-being hacks that can be protective factors against depression and anxiety. So good sleep hygiene, a nutritious diet, physical activity, social support and connection, and serving others. Along these lines, there's a bit of a, I don't know if joke is the right word, but if someone is thinking about coming into therapy, or you're thinking about, as a therapist, about taking on a client, that first you need to ask them, do you get sunlight every day? Do you walk, and do you serve others? And if the answers to all of those questions are yes, and someone is still struggling, well then come on in and let's talk about maybe having some therapy. So I'm curious, this will be the other time that we gather up again. What are the ways that you all are taking care of yourself? How are you putting well-being and if anyone...
Oh gosh. 911, please. You okay?
Here, I got an emergency button.
I just fell asleep.
Okay. Did you bang your head?
No. A couple of late
Maybe
nights.
not. Will you sit? There's a chair right here. Will you sit?
Speaking of sleep.
Slumber.
I'm gonna run down and grab a blood pressure cuff. I'll be right back.
Good. So you can break into groups and have that conversation.
Yeah, I'll be a group.
Bill and I will talk together.
So just briefly talking about the ways that we're taking care of ourselves and any ideas or things that you find work for you to kind of bolster your mood or things you might do if you're noticing that you're feeling a bit low. This will be brief and then we're almost done.
Yeah, I would be too.
I thought that that was a primary survival, both as a teacher and a mother. And so actual, there are so many different kinds of whatever the moment is, I actually do so if I don't energize, I do sort of this quick 3 in. of what we're trying to do, we're pursuing.
Thank you. All right, awesome. Appreciate everybody helping everybody else learn. Okay, so I promise some concluding thoughts now. I just wanted to say a few words about mental health for older adults specifically. So aging is associated with more positive overall emotional well-being and with greater emotional stability and also more complexity, meaning a mix of positive and negative emotions. And in addition, we already referenced this, but anxiety is sometimes a feature of aging. And again, we see this a little bit more in women, and it's highly treatable among older adults. So there's so much to say about all the discoveries happening in the mental health field, the connection between early life adversity and mental health over the lifespan is hugely important and interesting. The role of precision medicine and psychiatry and how that's helping us to understand the conditions that may manifest differently in different individuals. The role of AI in mental health, like everything else with AI, is just going to be just so rich for understanding and for conversation. And my personal favorite is the field of epigenetics, which among other things reveals to us how generational trauma and the impact of stress are passed down and actually affect the expression of our genes, all of which may reveal new targets for treatment. If you're looking for support, I recommend starting with your PCP for assistance and referrals. Psychology Today is a really good website for finding therapists, and you can filter with your zip code or your diagnoses, and that it's very user-friendly. For families dealing with serious mental illness, our local NAMI Washtenaw chapter is a wonderful resource. NAMI stands for the National Alliance for Mental Illness, and it's really helpful for family-to-family support. And when it comes to well-being across the lifespan for all ages, we know that our lives and our well lives are rooted in relationship and connection, and that promotes health and mental health for all of us. Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General of the United States, in 2020 he wrote a book called Together, The Healing Power of Social Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. And then last May, not surprisingly, his office issued an official report, and one of the things in that report, it was stated, given the significant health consequences of loneliness and isolation, we must prioritize building social connection the same way we have prioritized other critical health issues like tobacco, obesity, and substance use disorders. Together we can build a country that is healthier, more resilient, less lonely, and more connected. And I just want to share one other thing that Murthy stated. This was in a different context, but service is one of the greatest antidotes to loneliness. When we help somebody else, two things happen. One is that we forge connection with them. The second is that we remind ourselves that we have value and that can help us in times of our own loneliness. The less worthy we feel, the harder it is to reach out to other people. Yes, we do need more psychiatrists, better access to psychiatric care to address the mental health crisis that confronts our country. Yes, we do need more psychologists and social workers for that. Yes, we need the technology to bring the care that is needed to people in their homes. But we also need each other. We need to turn our attention to reinforcing the caring, supportive institutions, communities and relationships that give our lives purpose and meaning. We need to come up with ways to tip the balance toward love and away from fear, to rebuild the public square so that we can once again speak rationally with one another. To address the crisis of loneliness, we need to return to the core values of kindness, generosity, and friendship that are so essential to the social fabric of our communities. Ultimately, it comes down to one thing: embrace love. It has the extraordinary capacity to heal and is the force we need to reach for each and every day of our lives. Love is our oldest medicine. So, this church, First Presbyterian, the Gospel of Matthew, where we get the message that whenever 2 or 3 of you are gathered in my name, each one of you here are living these principles every day. Reach out, connect, take care of each other, serve others, and take care of yourself. So, oh my goodness, thank you for having me.
Questions?
It's 12:05, I'm sorry.
Well, anyone who has to leave,
You
go
know,
for it.
in response to what you just read there, when my daughter entered middle school, actually, someone spoke to all the parents, and she said, if there's one thing I can tell you to do for your child entering a difficult time as a teenager, when your child gets home, all you need to do is love them. And it was kind of like, you know, just love them, because they are in a zoo at school.
Yes,
And,
right.
and it was, I've never forgotten that.
Thank you so much for making that connection
Yeah.
between our kiddos and this message of caring for one another. Yeah, they all day long they're bombarded with the shoulds, the woulds, the coulds, and for home to be a place where it's not like how did it go on that test? You know, what's happening with the prom? But just love. Thank you.
I do have a question. First of all, thank you so much for doing so much for this. I have a question. So you say love. I have a friend, and she has a daughter. I'm a graduate from your family already, is working, but obviously there's an issue there, right? So it's about love. I mean, I feel like she loved her too much. It's at the point that she does not really respect her. I mean, they have a good relation, but I don't think she does not exhibit the adult behavior, like respect her for. So in this situation, actually, I was like, how can I help them? Because sometimes I was like, maybe we should get her away from her parents. Is that right?
So, yeah, I mean, obviously these stories are very individual and specific, but it is possible, and there's a lot of psychological reasons for this, that in parenting, that sometimes we don't focus enough on individuation, on giving our young people permission to fail and to make mistakes, and the growth that comes out of that. So obviously I don't know the specifics of the situation, but my sense is that you have an intuition about this that is likely somewhat valid, and someone like this might really benefit from an additional adult presence in their life that has more distance and is maybe able to tell things a little bit like they are, and maybe can be a little more direct.
But the danger is though, because I sort of, because if I try to help, but I don't know enough about mental health or psychology.
Yes. So I would thank you for recognizing that. So this goes back to the presence of a warm and caring adult. You don't need to be a mental health expert. You don't need to start analyzing all of the mistakes of her upbringing. You're there to be an additional person that she can trust, that she can write a resume with, that she can go on a walk with. You don't need to be the expert in the room. You just need to be you and to have that care for that person.
Yeah, I know, I think it's an individual case, it's very hard for you to.
Yeah, and I'm happy to talk more after, if that's helpful. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Oh my goodness.
From adult education, from
Faith
Thank you. Oh, may I open it? Oh, how cool, you have your own stickers?
Wow.